Hi everyone. Today we're talking about Plato's dialogue called the Euthyphro, named after one of the main characters in the dialogue. So, important points that we're going to cover in today's lecture. First, we're going to talk about what a dilemma is in general. Secondly, we're going to talk about what the Euthyphro Dilemma is in particular and why it's a problem. And third, we're going to talk about how that dilemma generalizes to other issues. So, just some background on the dialogue. So previously we talked about Plato's Apology, in which Socrates defends himself at his trial. The Euthyphro takes place shortly before that, so Socrates is on his way to that same trial, and he bumps into this guy named Euthyphro. Euthyphro himself is going to court in order to prosecute his own father. I believe the crime that Euthyphro's father is accused of is harming one of his slaves. So Euthyphro thinks that the right thing to do is, even though it's his own father, to hold him accountable under the law for mistreating his slave. Even though slavery was legal in Athens, mistreatment of slaves was not. Socrates raises the question of, well, what is the pious thing to do in a case like this, right? So, for example, you might ask, is it pious to prosecute one's own father? There's a bit of a dilemma, right? Do we put the law first or do we put family relationships first? Piety is kind of an old-fashioned term, but it means something like holiness or doing right by the gods. So somebody who is very religious and observant, prays a lot, you might describe them as pious. So in the context of ancient Greek practices, this would have been honoring the gods, doing what was expected of you for religious ceremonies, obeying the proper authorities and things like that. So anyway, Socrates asks some questions of Euthyphro, who does not end up giving satisfying answers, and then leaves. And Socrates continues on to his trial. So first, what is a dilemma in general? So we can define a dilemma as a choice between two options where both the options are bad ones. So if there were three choices, you'd call it a trilemma, right? But the same basic idea applies. You have limited options, and each of those options is unattractive in some way. So the basic structure is I must do either A or B. There's no third option. But A and B are both things that have serious downsides to them. So an example might be I can either attend class or not. If I do attend class, I might be bored, have a bad time, I'd rather be doing something else. But if I don't attend class, then I will miss the material and perhaps be unprepared for the exam. So you might say, okay, either go to my boring class or do poorly on the exam. Those are my only two options, and neither one is very attractive, but I must choose one of them. There's no way out of it. So that's what makes something a dilemma. So just a rundown of the main part of the dialogue, so the bit that is the most famous. Socrates asks this question of Euthyphro. Okay, what is piety? Right? How do we define this? What is its nature? How do we understand it? Euthyphro gives an answer that sounds pretty plausible at first. Piety is what the gods love. Right? So the gods, the divine authorities, approve of something, and that indicates that the things that they approve of, the things that they love, are pious. So, for example, if God loves it when you go to church, then going to church is the pious thing to do. But Socrates asks a difficult question here. He says, well, do the gods love piety because it is pious, or is something pious because the gods love it? So the difference here is, do the gods sort of say, hey, that's something pious over there, therefore we love it, and we encourage people to do it? Or are they just sort of making up whatever they want, and whatever they happen to like or love, that is what we understand to be pious, simply because they say so? Well, Euthyphro's first answer is to say, well, the gods love piety because it is pious. And Socrates points out, well, that means that piety is something independent of what the gods love. Right? That something is pious not because the gods happen to like it, but rather the gods like it because it is first and foremost a pious thing to do. Euthyphro basically says, I need to leave now, I don't want to talk about this anymore. He runs off, and Socrates heads into his trial, which you can read about in the Apology. So breaking this down a bit more, Euthyphro faces a dilemma here. So he claims that piety is somehow determined by what the gods love. But even if that's true, it's determined. We need to ask, what does that mean exactly? Socrates sees two options. Option A, the gods love something because it is already pious. Option B is something is pious because the gods happen to love it. There are problems with each one, and that's why this is a dilemma. It seems like these are the only two options. Both options are bad in some way. In this case, bad because they fail to answer the original question in a satisfying way. So what's the problem with option A of saying that the gods love something because it's already pious? Well, basically that it doesn't explain what piety is. What makes something pious in the first place? Perhaps it's true that the gods love something that is already pious, but what determines whether that's something pious in the first place that the gods will love or approve of? Option B is to say, okay, it's not that something is first pious and then the gods notice it, but rather it's the case that something is pious simply because the gods happen to love it. The problem with this, though, is that it would seem to make piety arbitrary. The gods could love anything, right? They could say the pious thing to do is to harm people or to steal from the church or something like that. And according to option B, that would mean, yes, those are pious things to do if and because the gods happen to approve of or love those things. So you might think that's not a great answer because piety can't just be something arbitrary. There needs to be something in the nature of things that sort of fixes or anchors whether something is pious or not. Now this dilemma, usually called the Euthyphro Dilemma, generalizes to various other issues, including things that might be more salient to us now than the concept of piety. Probably the most often used example would be morality. So we can ask, what makes something morally right or good? Right? So why is it wrong to harm people for no good reason? Why is it right to keep your promises? Things like that. One possible answer that people have given over the years is to say that, well, morality has something to do with God. Somehow God determines what's morally right and good and what's morally wrong and bad. However, we can raise the same question here that Euthyphro faced when trying to define and account for piety. The question is this: what do you mean when you say God determines morality? Do you mean option A, that something is moral simply because God approves of it? Or is it option B, that God approves of something because it is already moral? So this seems to be a dilemma because option A makes morality independent of God, whereas option B makes morality something totally arbitrary that God just makes up on a whim. Let's talk about that a bit more. So you could think of this in the following way. Does God determine what the moral facts are through his intellect or through his will? If through his intellect, then we might say God knows what the moral facts are, but does not create or establish those facts in the first place. So for example, God, all-knowing being, right, if such a being exists, might say, okay, hey, I'm wondering what's the right thing to do here. Let me think about this carefully with my intellect. And I see, oh, okay, murder is wrong. I, God, recognize that. And now maybe I will tell my followers, which is pretty nice of him if he does. The problem with this, though, is that it implies that moral facts are independent of God. So if God is simply using his intellect to find out what's right or wrong, then God isn't creating those facts. He is simply recognizing them. And he might be good at that, but it still doesn't explain where those moral facts come from in the first place. So why is murder wrong? Option A doesn't really answer that question. Okay, so we might say it isn't through God's intellect that morality is determined, but rather through God's will. Right? God just sort of creates through a voluntary action what the facts are regarding what's right or wrong. So for example, God just declares murder is wrong, and now it is so simply because God said so. The problem with this, though, once again, is that it implies that moral facts are arbitrary. Right? It seems to boil down to just might makes right. Right? God's in charge, so whatever he says goes. That means if God says murder is the most virtuous thing you could do, then it would become true on this option. Because God wills it, now it's the case. or God could change what the moral facts are from one day to the next. This seems unsatisfying because, again, it makes morality something just totally arbitrary and made up. Right? God could say anything. So you do see this debate in medieval philosophy between so-called voluntarism and intellectualism. The intellectualists say that God knows but doesn't create the moral law, whereas voluntarists say that God does just make up the moral law, and there's no reason for the content of what God says is right or wrong. It's just whatever he says, and there's no guidance to it because he's just making this stuff up in a totally arbitrary way. So both of those options, again, A and B, an example of the Euthyphro Dilemma applied to the question of where morality comes from and what its nature is. Both of those options seem to be unsatisfying in various ways. They don't seem to give great answers to our original question. What makes something moral or immoral? Why is murder wrong in the first place? A second question we might ask is, why should we be moral at all? So again, if we think morality has something to do with God, we might ask, well, why should we obey God's commands? One option is to say, because God has good reasons for those commands, right? That God knows what he's talking about, so you better trust what he says. That sounds reasonable, but once again, that implies that the moral facts are independent of God. So appealing to God doesn't really help us explain why morality exists at all, or why it's objective, or why we should be moral. So God sort of looks and sees, okay, murder is wrong, but what makes murder wrong in the first place? We still have that same original question. Alternatively, you might say you should be moral and obey God's commands simply because they are commands. But once again, we're back to the problem of that making morality something arbitrary, right? You're just obeying the commands of some powerful being who just says, do what I say because I say so, which doesn't seem like a great reason, right? We once again know, why is murder wrong? And if it just turns out because something that has a lot of power and rules over the universe simply said so, when they could have said murder was good, and that would be just as arbitrary as saying murder is wrong, doesn't seem like a very satisfying account. So you can sort of see how Euthyphro's dilemma raises problems for accounts of morality that want to base everything in God. So if sort of God-based moral theories aren't the best way to go, then how else might we account for morality? Well, here are a few options that philosophers have favored over the centuries. One idea is moral realism, where you could just say that moral facts or properties exist independently of our minds and independently of God's mind, if God exists, that they're somehow just built into the fabric of things. It's just a universal fact that murder is wrong, the same way that there are universal facts about gravity or other laws of nature. Of course, there's all sorts of questions, like where do these moral facts come from? Like, why do they exist? We still have those questions. How do we know them? But that would be a way of grounding morality in something other than God. It's just sort of built into the universe itself. Another option is to go relativistic and say that, well, moral facts are constructed by social groups. And since different groups have different ideas, at least on some things, regarding what's moral or immoral, this leads to the idea that there may be no universal truth about morality, but simply a relativistic truth. Namely that for this group over here, say equality among persons is the right thing to aim for, whereas in a more hierarchical society, perhaps for them the truth is that equality is not a good thing. This, to many philosophers, is unsatisfying because it seems to make morality simply up to the whims of individual groups and not ground it in anything deeper, right? If you have this intuition that murder is wrong, regardless of what your culture or society says, then you probably want something deeper than just the relativistic account for what makes it wrong. A third option is what's known as error theory. So this is the idea that when we go around making moral judgments, we're just making false claims. We're expressing false beliefs. And this is because, according to the error theorist, typically, there simply are no moral facts. right? That we have this idea and we talk as if murder was wrong, but it's simply not true that murder is wrong. That morality is just a sort of imaginary thing, something that we've kind of made up, but it doesn't actually answer to anything factual. Right? There's no true moral statement on this view. When we believe that murder is wrong, according to the error theorist, we are just believing in something that doesn't exist, namely this moral fact that actually has no reality at all. That's very brief. There are other theories out there as well. Each of these has some problems, reasons that you might push back against it, but that's just a quick rundown of some alternative views to the God-based moral theories that the Euthyphro Dilemma creates problems for. So what do we do with the Euthyphro Dilemma, right? How can it be resolved? Well, in general, you can try to get around dilemmas by showing that there's a third option that hasn't been accounted for. So remember, a dilemma occurs when you have two options, both options are bad. Well, if you can show that, hey, there's this third option that's been overlooked, and this third option doesn't have downsides, then that would be a way of resolving the dilemma. Another common way is to show that one of the two options is actually not bad after all. So for example, going back to our example of voluntarists in medieval philosophy, they were just happy to say, yeah, morality is arbitrary. God just makes it all up. What's the problem with that, right? God's this all-powerful being, the creator of the universe, so it stands to reason that God created the moral facts in the same way as he created facts about natural laws, right? So facts about gravity and how physics works and chemistry and the sort of constants that govern the universe. Why not? Is it really a problem to say that morality is arbitrary based on God's will? It's God, after all, so maybe that isn't a bad option after all. Some people defend that view. So in their view, Euthyphro does not face a dilemma, but rather he should just go full scale on the side that says, yeah, something is pious simply because the gods say so, right? The gods just make all this up, and perhaps that's not problematic after all. We do have various open questions here, however. First, can the Euthyphro Dilemma be resolved in one of the ways that we just mentioned, or possibly in some other way? So that's still hotly debated even today. We have this very big question: is morality something that's objective? So are there moral truths? Are there facts that make certain moral beliefs true? And if so, how could that be the case? What makes morality objective? And how could we ever know what the objective truths of morality are? You might just go full-on relativist and say, well, there are no objective moral facts. Possibly, but then we'd have to say that it's not an objective fact that, say, slavery is wrong or something like that. And that really clashes with our intuition sometimes, right? It really seems like certain things are just simply wrong, right? And you can pick many examples. Finally, and this is related to the question of morality's objectivity, is what, if anything, justifies our moral beliefs, right? So maybe I decide to be a moral realist and say, I think that murder is wrong simply because it's a universal fact of the universe that's somehow built into the fabric of reality. Okay, that's possible maybe, but how do I know that, right? How could I possibly justify that? And how could I possibly justify particular moral beliefs that would come out of that? So how do I know that murder is wrong because of the truth of moral realism? Again, there are lots of discussions about this. Philosophers debate the questions of how we can know anything when it comes to our supposed moral duties and obligations. Okay, so that's it for this time. I'll talk to you next time. Thank you.